This is the presentation for key issue 3 of ethnicity. Why do conflicts arise among ethnicities? And this is an age-old question. We're not going to come to a earth-shattering conclusion here, but we will look at some of the main reasons why ethnicities engage in conflict with one another. Now, we know that our ethnic diversity has led to a very rich world heritage. It's one of the things that we highlight in our country, and in particular at our school. One of the things we really value is our diversity. And yet, the fact that there are different ethnicities has led to a lot of conflict. There's a tendency among human beings to focus on the other and how different they are from you and how you can blame things on them. But also territorial claims. So claims over land and the resources in that land often lines up with ethnicities. Now this picture here is of a cluster bomb found in the Yuba Mountains of Sudan. The Yuba Mountains is in North Sudan. Those familiar with the region will know that the country split just a few years ago, creating the newest state, which is the state of South Sudan. And the reason they split is because of war between the North and the South, but it's really a civil war between people who are ethnically Arab in Africa, who had most of the control over the government, and those who are of various African ethnicities. But it could be brought down to a racial war, if you want to consider it that way, or a religious war, because those who were Arab were lighter skinned, those who were in the South fighting against the government were dark skinned, what many would traditionally think of when they picture Africans. But it was also religious between Muslims in the north and animists, and which would be a collection of tribal languages, if you don't remember, not languages, I'm sorry, religions, and Christians, more in the south. And that is the difficult part about looking at these conflicts, is that so often it comes down to more than just ethnicity. It's religion, it is national identity. And the waters can get kind of murky, but we're going to do our best to understand this. I put this picture up just because my friend was from this region, and he had to flee and ended up in Egypt and several other countries before making it to America, just because of this ongoing crisis. And it is an ongoing crisis. This isn't one you hear much about, but the Yuba Mountains is still seeing a lot of warfare from a rebellion group that is fighting against the government, and the government which is dropping bombs on civilian areas, as you see here. Okay, let's get started. I think first, to understand this, we need to make sure we have an understanding of the difference between ethnicity and nationality. This is something we went over in class, but let's take another look. Nationality is identity with a group of people who share legal attachment and personal allegiance to a particular country. It differs with ethnicity in terms of legal standing. Remember, nationality is the more legal side, ethnicity is the more cultural side of things. Politicians often try to instill unity in their nation through patriotism and nationalism. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. A little bit more about some more examples for distinguishing between ethnicity and nationality. Here's some elements of ethnicity. Values are derived from culture. Religion, language, material culture, distinct ancestry, all of these usually play a role in making an ethnicity fundamentally different from another one. And when when I say fundamentally different, that might be going a little too far, right? Because one ethnicity can have the same religion as another. It's not like every ethnicity has their own religion, but it might be practiced in a certain way. It might be a little bit different than the way another group does it. For instance, in Iran, um, people who are considered Persian, they're more likely to be Shiite Muslims than they are Sunni Muslims. So there is a connection definitely between what religion you have and what ethnicity you may be. Again, it doesn't mean everyone in a particular ethnicity has the same religion. There are Kurdish people who are Muslim, there are Kurdish people who are Christian, and a number of other religions. But often there is an element of identity associated with your religion. Language is the other really big one here. People often use language as a way of identifying themselves different than others. We'll look at some other examples of that. But some examples of ethnicities, African American is an ethnicity. We talked about how Black may be a race, which isn't very helpful in understanding people, but African American is an ethnicity. Chinese Americans, that's an ethnicity. It's not a nationality, right? If you're born here and you have Chinese parents, you're an American, but you might have consider yourself to be ethnically Chinese. Polish Americans, right? There's another example. Just watched a great movie called The Polka King. Maybe I shouldn't call it a great movie, but it was pretty funny. And it's got Jack Black with this awful accent being a Polish person. Check it out. It's pretty good. True story. Nationality. Nationality, your values are derived from political systems. Okay, so your values have to line up with the law, and we can talk later on about what all that entails, but just know that the law is something that people have to agree upon, at least in general terms. Now, you don't have to agree with the law, but you do have to abide by it. But those who created the law agree that this is how we're going to live our lives. It's not necessarily based on tradition. Sometimes it is, but your values are based in law rather than based in tradition. This includes voting, where you get your passport, the types of civic duties that you perform, documents promoting life, like the Declaration of Independence. All these things tie into an identity that is more legally and politically derived, that is your nationality. Examples, American. So notice all those ethnicities uh, given as examples, those would fit under the American nationality, or Moroccan, or Japanese. Sometimes ethnicity and nationality line up really well. Japanese people, for instance. If you're Japanese living in Japan, your ethnicity is Japanese and your nationality is Japanese. But what we're going to see and what gives rise to so much of this conflict is that ethnicities and nationalities don't perfectly line up in space. Okay, let's move on. For us to get a better understanding of this, let's make sure we know how to distinguish between nationality, ethnicity, and race in the United States. Nationality identifies citizens of the United States, and citizens may be people who share common values associated with the doctrines of the U.S. But the U.S. also has to agree that you're a citizen, right? You can't just be like, well, I share these values. No, there's a process you have to go through unless you're born here. Ethnicity identifies groups with distinct ancestry and cultural traditions. Example, African Americans, Hispanic Americans. There's that ancestry. It doesn't necessarily have to go back to a different place, but it often does. But cultural traditions are a part of this. And the thing about ethnicity is, you can kind of choose how much is a part of your identity. So if you're African American, but you don't really buy into any of the cultural traditions, or you don't really care that much about being in a group, I suppose you can limit that as a part of your ethnic, as a part of your identity. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean others will. Values coming from religion, history, languages, and culture play into that as well. But race really just distinguishes blacks and other persons of color from whites. Okay, this is why race is not helpful. This is why race is destructive for the most part. It is just a way of saying that people are not white. All right, let's go outside the United States and take a look at the confusing issue of the British Isles. Now, the British Isles include Ireland, which you see on the west or the left in that picture, and Great Britain on the right. Great Britain itself has 4 different ethnicities. English, whose ancestry goes back to those Germanic tribes, and we looked at how the English people got here to England when we studied language. You can go take a look back at that if you need to. Welsh, who have Celtic ancestry and have mostly assimilated into the English way of life in Great Britain. And the Scots, who were Celtic until a Scot became the king and united the two peoples. Okay, and yet there is still some division between Scotland and England because while they are under the same government, there was a referendum not too many years ago, just a couple of years back, where the Scottish tried to vote to leave the United Kingdom and be their own country. It did not pass, but there has been rumors about it since the Brexit vote, which I'll talk about later, happening again. I'm not sure what the update on that issue is. Currently, they are still part of the United Kingdom. And Irish. Irish are Celtic people ruled by England until the 20th century when they became mostly independent. But part of the island in the north is actually part of the United Kingdom. So when we start talking about the United Kingdom as a state, it gets a little bit more confusing. But here we go. It comprises Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The term British actually refers to the nationality. So if you ever wonder, what does it mean? Why do some people say British, some people say English, some people say UK? Well, British is the actual nationality. The Republic of Ireland comprises the southern 84% of the southern island of Ireland. And it contains one major ethnicity, which is Irish. And it's really unfair for me to put a picture of a leprechaun up there. When I was visiting Ireland, one of the things people were sure to tell me is that they were not involved with any kind of leprechaun mischief, and it really wasn't a part of their life. So it's really unfair for me to put that up there, but I did. Within the United Kingdom, a strong element of ethnic identity comes from sports. England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, they all have their own national soccer teams and compete separately. This is where it gets really confusing because I know I just said the nationality is British, right? But these places were their own nations at different times. Okay, there was a king of England, there was a king of Scotland, there was a king of Wales, and because they have a history of self-rule, self-governance, they could be considered separate nations. So you could consider the United Kingdom a multi-nation state. Okay, it's still a state, it's a multi-nation state. And in a minute, we're going to talk about nation states, right? So those are ones where people's ethnicity mostly lines up with their state, with their government. So even though they're under the same country, they have all these strong different ethnic identities. And you see this in their sports. What I have pictured here is from a movie called Green Street Hooligans. I don't know if I can recommend it. I saw it a long time ago. But it's about these gangs that form and are associated with certain football teams or soccer teams, and they actually will fight each other. Okay, so the outcome of these games will result in massive violence in the streets. Not as much now as maybe a decade ago. It's getting a little bit more peaceful, but I think it's just a very fundamental example of how ethnicity can lead to violence, even in somewhere that seems as peaceful as Great Britain. Now, I just mentioned that the United Kingdom is considered a multi-nation state. It's got different groups who, over time, had their own governments, had their own kings, and have a distinct ethnicity, have a distinct history of their own, and yet they are now together under one government. That's a multi-nation state. A nation state, as you could imagine, is going to be where just one group really has their own government. We'll talk about this in just a second. Once ethnic groups have been transformed into nationalities, they want to govern themselves in their own lands. This idea is called self-determination. We will determine how we live our lives. We will determine the rules that we live under, the laws. We will determine our government. It's been used by political leaders to organize the surface of the earth. And of course, as these groups got bigger and as they got closer to each other, borders were created. And so you had nation states. Think about Europe. Think about the Germanic people becoming German, okay, as a nationality. Think about the French becoming, where the French were once just an ethnicity, they became a nation, and then they became a state as their borders had to line up against another state's borders or another nation. So those would be nation states. That is a state whose territory corresponds to that occupied by a particular nationality. So if you don't understand the difference between nationality and ethnicity, you're going to have to rewind or shoot me a message or ask me in class. But you have to understand that to get this. But you also have to understand how a nation is different than a state, right? Nation is, think about it being as more of a historical thing, that these people have always grouped themselves together. They have had a history of self-government, of self-rule, and now to make it a nation state, it has to have boundaries, right? It has to have laws. It has to have its own particular territory. This never completely works, okay? Ethnicities spill over into neighboring areas as well, and this is one of those reasons for conflict that we will talk about. But some examples of nation states, Germany, North Korea, South Korea, China, Japan is a really good one, right? It's because Japan works very hard to keep their minorities at a minimum, right? They don't want their country to get watered down by different ethnicities. Just some food for thought. Do you think nation states will exist in the future as international immigration continues? So I mentioned France as a nation state, but France has a lot of immigration from North Africa and the Middle East, and you can see that depicted there with the Eiffel Tower in the background. Not really the people that you picture when you think about France, right? They're not wearing berets, they're wearing hijab. And likewise, that picture on the bottom left, that's the United Arab Emirates, okay, on the Arabian Peninsula where Islam started. And here's this obviously Western woman doing getting her shopping on, and certainly not wearing what would be considered appropriate for Muslim women to be wearing in that country. And so what we're seeing as ethnicities are switching places, they're moving around, they are expanding out from their normal place of origin. And so the question is, are nation states going to continue to exist, or will we get to a point in human history where you can't really see ethnicities lined up with states? I don't know. It's just something to consider. And when thinking about that, we have to understand that the term to use is that nations are becoming more heterogeneous, meaning mixed. It's the opposite of homogeneous, which is everyone's the same. Nations or states are becoming more heterogeneous. Just take a quick look at the development of nation states. Of course, they developed organically over time. Then some got very powerful and took over other nations, creating empires. World War II is where we saw a lot of this, or some of those empires break down. They were broken apart in hopes of creating new nation states, but it never worked out perfectly, and it never does. But just take a look at how those empires were broken down, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The idea is, okay, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, we've got these Czechoslovakian people. That's their ethnicity. They should have their own country. They should have a nation state. We have people who are Austrian. They should have a nation state. We should have people who are Hungarian. They should have a nation state. The idea is you won't get as much violence if people have their own country. But of course, you can never perfectly separate people. There's not any true perfect nation states, but the closest we have is probably Denmark. Its borders correspond closely to where Danish-speaking people live. So if we're talking about their ethnicity, remember their ethnicity is a lot of things, but one part of it is probably their language. And if they speak Danish, that's their ethnicity. And so their borders line up pretty well. But the problem is that there's this part next to Germany, which was lost in the 1800s to Germany, then reclaimed after World War I. But some Danish-speaking peoples live in Germany, and some Germans live in Denmark. When I was in France one year, I met someone, and I was asking where she was from. And one time she told me she was from Germany. The other time she told me, and later when we were having a conversation, she told me that she was Danish, and it just did not make any sense to me, and came to understand that she lived in this area, which has a lot of back and forth between Germany and Denmark. And so even Denmark is not a perfect nation state. Nationalism typically promotes a sense of national consciousness that exalts one nation above all others and emphasizes its culture and interests as opposed to other nations. This can be a good thing. There's a lot of great things that a country can do if people will actually, think about the fact that there's something bigger than themselves, caring for others in their country, wanting their country to succeed, wanting it to be the best that it can. But there's a lot of negative that can come out of this. We'll take a look at both. So it can be a positive thing. It can be a centripetal force. Remember, centripetal brings people together. It unifies. I think of the petals on a flower as being unified right there together. So war, terrorist attacks, these can actually lead to a greater sense of nationalism. They can also result from nationalism, but they can lead to a greater sense of nationalism and bring people together. Famous speech that President George W. Bush made on the rubble of the Twin Towers after 9/11 terrorist attack, which was just kind of a rousing call for the United States to be united, that we are American, that's what makes us different, and we're going to get through this. And I remember it being, and of course y'all are too young to remember, but I remember it being a time where people really, it sounds cheesy, but we're proud to be Americans, not in a redneck America kind of way, but just proud to be a part of this country and wanting the best for everyone in the country. And that was what I would say, the good side of nationalism is bringing people together. So often in this country we're split apart by politics and by race and sometimes by religion. But to see each other all in the same way as Americans, that's definitely a positive thing. International sports matches bring people together, right? You've got the World Cup, and that instills a great sense of pride in most countries, the ones that can actually compete pretty well, right? And it's kind of an area where our country can go head to head against a bigger and stronger country and feel like they are on the same plane, right? And the Olympics. Think about what athletes can accomplish who have their nations behind them, right? And think about how good it feels to watch the Olympics and see your flag represented and see those gold medals. Your guy won. This is the greatest of all time. I'm not going to get into a debate about who the greatest American athlete of all time is, but when it comes down to the medals, there's no doubt it's Michael Phelps. He's got, I think, 23, 22 gold medals, which is absurd, way more than anyone else in history. But sometimes nationalism can be a centrifugal force. And I think of a centrifuge like that ride where you get pushed up against the wall. You get pushed out from the middle. So you get separated. Instead of being brought together to the middle, you're pushed out in different directions. And this can result from and lead to war, terrorism, nasty politics. It can be caused by religious differences, language differences. These can all be different centrifugal forces. And when we saw recently the rally of the alt-right in Charlottesville, Virginia, which actually resulted in death, and certainly don't want to make light of that event because it was pretty terrible and what it stood for was pretty terrible. But these guys had tiki torches, which is kind of hilarious. But they were protesting supposedly not having freedom of speech. They were protesting these Confederate statues being planned for to be taken down, or at least people talking about taking them down. I'm not sure. But what really many of the people, not all, but many of the people who were there were grouping themselves together for is to say that we are white, and because we're white, we are truly American, not like these other people. And that is our heritage, and we're going to hold on to that, and that's what makes us great. Okay? Now, a lot of them were afraid to say that, but some, if you watched it, were definitely not afraid to say that. And that is a kind of scary thing. But just keep in mind, it was a very small minority of the American public. This looks like a lot of people, but think about how many millions of people are in this country. Not like that. And yet, this is something that is pushing people apart, right? Last year, Catalan, which is a region of France, the area that has Barcelona, it tried to gain independence with a referendum. And a referendum is just a vote. One of their main arguments is they have a different language, and so they have a different culture, so they have a different ethnicity. And you see on the left their flag that they want to have their country stand behind. It failed. They weren't able to do it. The main leader of their movement was had to flee to, I think, Belgium, and this may come back. It may come back around. I'm sure that the people of Catalan are not going to give up. But one of their main complaints is that they make more money than the people in the rest of Spain, and so they're having to pay more taxes than those people, and they don't want more of their money going to another region. So this resulted in a small amount of violence, not anything like civil war, but we can definitely see the potential there, and we can see the potential, if it succeeds, for other parts of Europe to break away from their countries, like Scotland breaking away from the United Kingdom, or Flanders breaking away from the rest of Belgium. Another example from recent history is the Rohingya. The Rohingya are a Muslim ethnic minority in Myanmar, which used to be called Burma, which is the Southeast Asian country. The majority of Myanmar is Buddhist. And so right away we see the main difference, the very important difference here between these ethnicities is religion. But they also have their own language, they have their own culture. They say they're descendants of Arab traders and other groups who have been in the region for generations. But the government of Myanmar denies the Rohingya citizenship and even excludes them from the census that they took in 2014. And so they're not recognizing them as a people group. They're kind of this stateless people. I won't say stateless nation because it's only been a couple decades that the term Rohingya has really been used to identify them, even by themselves. But they are nevertheless about 1 million people who have been in kind of this contention with the government. Some of them there were some militants in the Rohingya that attacked the military police in that region, the Myanmar military, and then of course the Myanmar military retaliated with excessive force, and many people are calling this a genocide. These people have been fleeing to neighboring countries, and it's an ongoing situation that does not look good. At least right now, these people are in refugee camps, but this is a current issue, and you see that religion plays a role in it, language plays a role in it, and when people don't have citizenship, they don't have rights, they don't have protection, and that's part of the problem. Okay, recall from past chapters that people from different cultures disagree for many reasons. They may be unhappy when they can't practice their traditional way of life. They are unhappy over education and language policies that are unfair. They disagree over job opportunities and sharing economic resources. They disagree on how the environment is used, or they disagree when the main culture or opinions or wants are forced upon them. So there's a lot of different reasons people could disagree. You don't need a textbook to tell you that. But just keep note that as people group themselves into ethnicities with people that they have more similarities with, then that just exacerbates the problem, because you have all these people who kind of see life one way up against all these people who see life another way. So it's not like a small dispute that you may have with your brother or sister that can be put to rest at the end of the day, or the end of the week or month at least, hopefully. But when you include hundreds or thousands or millions of people in this, it just makes the problem much bigger and much more likely to result in violence. Okay, multi-ethnic societies are made up of different ethnic groups. They may be different in their culture, their religion, their physical features or language, their beliefs or values or customs, or all of them. Those differences add up to cultural diversity, which we celebrate and we like. However, we know this can cause misunderstanding and tear apart societies. So our society, for instance, is pretty multi-ethnic, right? The United States has people from all different backgrounds who, many of which speak different languages, have different religions, different look different, have different beliefs and different customs. But keep in mind that popular culture usually gets a hold of those people and kind of in the United States pulls them a certain direction, kind of toward the middle, so that we all at least have some common ground. Okay, but we know this can lead to ethnic competition because unless you have the ethnicities completely equal in the number of people that are there, you're going to have one group that has an advantage over another. Let's talk about Lebanon because your book talks about Lebanon. Population of 4 million people, 10,000 square miles, so it's a pretty small place. It used to be a relatively rich and nice area, at least peaceful, okay, which is an unusual thing to say about a country in the Middle East. But Lebanon was considered a kind of center of uh, tourism, even, but it was considered pretty peaceful and a good stronghold in the Middle East. So we're going to look at what happened since the 1970s. Now, keep note the diversity that is in Lebanon. At the surface, it appears to be more religious, actually, than ethnic. You or I probably would have trouble distinguishing just by looking at someone in Lebanon between a Muslim and a Christian. Okay, especially because some Christian women there actually wear the head covering, the hijab. And I'll go ahead and say that as a tradition historically was more about where you're from than what your religion was. In the Byzantine Empire, all women covered up their hair as just a sign of piety. And later on, as Western culture shifted further west, Eastern culture remained where it is. It became more of a just a Muslim thing to do that. But there, of course, are Muslims who don't do that. All that to say, just looking at a Lebanese person, you might not know their religion. Nearly all Lebanese Christians consider themselves ethnically descended from the ancient Phoenicians, who were traders and sailors in the Mediterranean, and Lebanon's Muslims consider themselves Arabs. So ethnicity often comes down to how people identify themselves. And you can watch videos on YouTube about people getting DNA tests and they thought they were this one ethnicity their whole life. And it turns out they're really not from that part of the world or their ancestors aren't. Kind of interesting. It doesn't mean it's not important, but it's not always necessarily grounded in uh, geographic differences. The religious groups in Lebanon are not evenly distributed. Keep in mind, this is a reality throughout most of geography. Ethnic groups, religious groups, any kind of groups of people are usually not evenly distributed in a particular space. Maronites are in the West Central, those are the Christians. It's a particular sect of Christianity. Sunnis, of course, largest group of Muslims, are in the southwest, and you'll note that there are actually more Shiites here in Lebanon than there are Sunnis. There are a couple countries where that's the case. Iran is one, Lebanon is another. In general, though, there are more Sunnis in any given country than there would be Shiites. And Beirut, the capital, is divided between a Christian eastern zone and a Muslim western zone. All right, we're going to go through a quick history of the civil war in Lebanon. So a lot of these civil wars kind of go back to when Europeans hand power back over to countries getting their independence, because we know Europeans had these huge empires throughout the world. And so we often, it's very easy to blame the Europeans for their mistakes, and I'm not going to cut them any slack. But I will say that we know war and civil war have occurred all over the world, long before empires and long after empires. And that doesn't excuse the mistakes that they made or problems that they caused, but we don't want to oversimplify a problem or overcomplicate it for that matter, right? People group themselves, they find reasons to hate another group, they fight the other group. Christians were the majority and they controlled the main businesses, which means they had more money in Lebanon at the start of this new government. When Muslims, after the creation of Israel, became the majority, they demanded political and economic equality. Now, why do you think Muslims became a majority after the creation of Israel? It's because so many Palestinians were pushed out of the area that would become Israel, and they had to go somewhere. In addition, the West, the US and the UK, supported the ethnic Phoenicians, and the USSR, which is the Soviet Union, would later become Russia again, supported the Arabs. So you had this Cold War tension going on. And if you study Cold War history, you learn a lot about how the USSR and the Western countries like the US and the UK backed different groups silently and quietly and were pulling some strings. The government could not handle the changing social and political systems, and this resulted in civil war. Lasted from 1975 to 1990, but there's still tension now. And during that civil war, each of the religious groups formed their own private army and militia to guard their territory. As battles waged, each territory controlled changed according to who won, so it got confusing. We're going to go ahead and move on to looking at ethnic competition in Sri Lanka. If I went too fast through the Civil War in Lebanon, go back in your book and read through it slowly and let me know any questions you have. Sri Lanka is an island country with 19 million people. It's inhabited by three principal ethnicities. You have the Sinhalese, who are the majority with 73%. 74%. Don't worry about the percent exactly, but no, they're the majority. They migrated from northern India in the 5th century, converted to Buddhism, and speak an Indo-European language. So some big things that identify them, obviously their religion, where they're from, and their language. The Tamil people are just about 16%. They migrated from India in the 3rd century BC. They're Hindu and they speak a Dravidian language, Tamil. So no, those three major differences, although they all come from India, but India is such a diverse place, that doesn't mean that much, honestly. That's not something that they're going to be like, oh, you're from India too? Oh, awesome. We're the same. Not going to happen. And then the Moors are 10%. They're ethnically Arab, and they migrated from Southwest Asia in the 8th century AD. So they haven't been here as long. They're Muslim, and they speak either Tamil or Sinhalese. So they speak one of those two languages. But the main competition has between the Sinhalese and the Tamil, or Tamil. I'm not good at saying it. So, do you know where Sri Lanka is? Sri Lanka is off the coast of India. It's a big island in the south. The dispute between Sri Lanka's two largest ethnicities extends back more than 2,000 years. Tamils feel they have suffered discrimination at the hands of the Sinhalese-dominated government, and there's been a long war between the ethnicities. It ended in 2009 with the defeat of the Tamils. With 74% versus what did I say? 16%? Yeah, 74% versus 16%. Who did you think was going to win? So this happened after the end of European control, right? So the British were down here in South Asia. They controlled everything. Why do you think this happened? Is it because the British left and they messed something up? Or is it because the British weren't there to prevent it? Different people will have different takes on this. If this lasted 2,000 years, this competition, then to me, it makes much sense that while the British were there keeping things in order, they prevented it from getting out of hand. But once they left, there was nothing they could do, and so this war erupted, which had been brewing for thousands of years. Okay, so it was suppressed during the 300 years of European rule. After independence in 1948, the country was dominated by Sinhalese, and they controlled the government and the military and most of the commerce. And the war lasted from 83 to 2009, with the Sinhalese winning, just as I said. And now the Tamils fear that their military defeat jeopardizes their ethnic identity. This is a multinational state, right? And with a multinational state, if you don't have people buying into the state itself, if you don't have people who really value the fact that they are part of that state more, or at least as much as they value being a part of a particular ethnicity, then you're going to have conflict. Few ethnicities inhabit an area that matches the territory of a nationality. You can blame it on the British for dividing South Asian ethnicities among nationalities. Britain's end of colonial rule of the Indian subcontinent in 1947 gave birth to two new countries, India and Pakistan. Some will be surprised to learn that before the British took over the Indian subcontinent, there wasn't this much of an idea of being Indian. Okay, so people, considered themselves from particular towns or villages or regions, maybe, but most of their identity came from a more local sense of place or their religion or their language, not from being Indian, right? Because it was Great Britain who unified India. Pakistan was comprised of two non-contiguous, meaning not touching, areas called West and East Pakistan. As you can imagine, pretty hard for two areas separated by India to actually function as one country. And East Pakistan would split off and later become Bangladesh in 1971. But the reason they separated West and East Pakistan from India was ethnic differences. And most of those corresponded to religion. Just as we're thinking about how these things lead to problems, I want to just give you a kind of a funny example. And I'm not likening human beings to animals, but think about it this way. If all of a sudden the bars and the walls between all the exhibits at the zoo were removed, you would still have most animals grouped together with their own, but others would wander, right? They would end up in another animal species territory, and it would not be a pretty sight, would it? And when our political boundaries don't perfectly line up with our ethnicities or nationalities, there are problems. And that's what we have seen in India and Pakistan. Now, they've mostly partitioned based on religion. The majority of people in India, in this part of India, were Hindu, and the majority of people in this part, in the West and the Far East, were Muslim. And so that's why they made Pakistan separate from India and then later Bangladesh separate from India. You can see here the migration flows that occurred after independence. So in 1947, it's partitioned. This results in migration of an estimated 17 million people. And the creation of Pakistan as two territories, nearly 1,600 kilometers apart, that's 1,000 miles, that's just unsustainable. In 1971, East Pakistan became the independent country of Bangladesh. There's been a lot of violence, especially along the border of India and Pakistan, as you have some people who are a religious minority surrounded by people who see the world very different than they do. But that's not to say that Muslims and Hindus don't get along in India, because in many places they do, but in many places they don't. Let's talk about the Kurds. We've looked at the Kurds briefly in class. You know, this is a stateless nation of people. They are most of them are Sunni Muslims. There are a small percentage, or a sizable percentage of them are Christian. They speak a language in the Iranian group of the Indo-Iranian branch of Indo-European, and their culture features distinctive literature, dress, and traditions. After World War I, the European Allies demarcated land for the Kurds and called it Kurdistan. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne established what would have been Kurdistan as part of what is Turkey. But the 1923 treaty never really established that. It just never worked. The 1920 Treaty of Sèvres, which was to give Kurds a country, was never ratified. And today, Kurds are divided amongst several countries: eastern Turkey, northern Iraq, western Iran, and Syria. Here's just some pictures that my sister took when she lived in Kurdistan. That's one of the biggest, mosques. That is her house. Very unique style of its own. And in the top left, Texas chicken. I have no idea, but it does bring me to a point that the Kurds have often had a very good relationship with Western countries, which cannot be said about a number of other groups in the Middle East. And so they've partnered with the United States a lot, and that's why you might see Texas chicken being advertised. Let's just quickly run over, I know this has been a long lecture, but we're going to quickly run over some other ethnic makeup in Western Asia. In Iraq, 3/4 of Iraqis are Arabs, 2/3 Shiite, 1/3 Sunni. 1/6 of Iraqis are Kurds. Most Iraqis have stronger loyalty to a tribe or clan than to a nationality or major ethnicity. And as I said before, this is a recipe for conflict. When you're more, when you identify more with your smaller group than your large country, then of course you're going to be more likely to go fight people. Iran, the most numerous ethnicity is Persian, and Persians usually adhere to Shiite Islam. In Afghanistan, the most numerous ethnicities include Pashtun, Tajik, and Hazara. A faction of Pashtun called the Taliban emerged, and it gained control over most of the country in 1995, though it had control over a lot of it long before that. It proceeded to rule with policies based on Islamic fundamentalism. The U.S. war in Afghanistan worked to weaken the Taliban. Taliban still exists, but it certainly does not control, doesn't have as much power, and doesn't rule with the iron fist that it had. I won't say that the war in Afghanistan was completely successful. You can look into that yourself and decide. But if you're interested in Afghanistan, if you haven't already, the book Kite Runner does a really good job of just taking you through the history, the recent history of it, and it has one of its central plot points is around the fact that these two boys who are childhood friends have different ethnicities, and one of them as part of the dominant ruling ethnicity, and therefore that drives them apart. A really good story. Get you a box of tissues before you read it. Pakistan is the country that has the most numerous ethnicity in Pakistan is Punjabi, and this is also a language. And so you could, I guess, look up the best Punjabi songs of 2016. The complex distribution of ethnicities and nationalities across Western Asia is a major source of conflict. And it should come as no surprise that we have seen a lot of conflict across this part of the world, across Southwest Asia, because you have so many different ethnicities. You have people who are not buying into their state or their nation as part of their identity. Here many of us would say, we are Americans and we're proud of that. We don't say, I'm a Tennessean and I hate the rest of these states, right? We are at least willing to uh, align ourselves with the rules and the law and the government that is above us, even if we don't always agree with it. And yet, in this part of the world, governments really struggle to get their people on board. And in the next lecture, we're going to examine the issue of ethnic cleansing and genocide, which is just taking these conflicts a number of steps further to where you see a great deal of destruction and displacement. So if you have any questions, as always, please write them down. Please bring them up to me. I need to make sure you understand this stuff, and we will end with that.